The Boeing 777's engines had been silent for 12 seconds when Captain Morrison's voice cracked over the intercom. Not the practiced, butter-smooth tone passengers expected from a pilot with 30 years under his wings, but something raw, unfiltered. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is. We need." A pause that stretched like altitude sickness. "If anyone aboard has any flight experience, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately." In seat 7B, Raina Volkov's thumb stopped moving across her phone screen. The text to her daughter, something about picking up groceries, mundane in its normalcy, hung unfinished. Around her, 317 passengers erupted into the kind of chaos that only comes when the impossible becomes immediate. A businessman in 7A grabbed his armrest hard enough to whiten his knuckles. The couple across the aisle clutched each other, with the desperation of people who just discovered their mortality at 37,000 feet. Raina didn't move. Not at first. Her eyes, gray as a storm system over the Baltic, remained fixed on her phone screen where the cursor blinked after "Don't forget the." 23 years of muscle memory kept her breathing steady, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the way she'd learned when pulling 9GS in an F-16 Viper over Afghanistan, the way she'd breathed when the surface-to-air missile locked onto her aircraft, the way she'd breathed in the 17 seconds before ejection, watching her plane become a $16 million fireball in the Hindu Kush Mountains. A flight attendant badge-reading Jennifer, hands shaking like autumn leaves, was moving through first class, her professional smile replaced by naked terror. "Anyone? Please, we need. The captain and first officer are." She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The phone screen dimmed in Raina's hands. She could feel it again, that familiar weight settling across her shoulders like an old flight suit. The one she'd folded carefully 7 years ago, placing it in a storage unit along with her medals, her call sign patch, and the letter of recommendation from General Patricia Hayes that called her the finest pilot I've commanded in 3 decades of service. The storage unit she'd never visited since the day the Air Force psychologist cleared her for civilian life, but recommended she pursue opportunities outside aviation. Through the window, cumulus clouds drifted past like ghosts of sorties flown. The sun painted them gold and crimson, the same colors that had painted the sky over Kandahar the morning she'd earned her call sign. The morning she'd saved 12 Marines pinned down in a valley, dropping ordnance so close to friendly positions that command had tried to court-martial her before the grateful ground forces intervened. They'd called her Whisper after that, for the way she could put death exactly where it needed to be, quiet as a prayer, precise as a promise. Jennifer had reached row 5 now. Nobody had responded. Of course they hadn't. Who could possibly? Raina stood. The movement was economical, practiced. She'd stood the same way 1,000 times before, in ready rooms and briefing halls, in the moments before stepping into cockpits that would carry her into hostile skis. Her seatmate, the businessman who'd been eyeing her legs since boarding, actually recoiled. Something in her posture had changed. Something in the way she occupied space, no longer compressed into the middle seat of row 7, but expanding to fill some larger, more dangerous dimension. "Ma'am," Jennifer's voice cracked with hope and terror in equal measure. Raina's phone buzzed. The text to her daughter auto-saved to drafts. "Don't forget the," it read, unfinished, a thought suspended between 2 worlds. Between the life she'd built in suburbs where nobody knew what a CCIP bombing run was, and the life where she'd been Captain Raina Volkov, call sign Whisper, the woman who'd logged more combat hours than any female pilot in Air Force history. "I can fly," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made generals lean forward in Pentagon briefings. Around her, the chaos stilled, 317 souls turning toward the woman in 7B who'd been invisible until she chose not to be. The businessman's mouth opened slightly, recognition dawning, not of her face, but of something deeper. The recognition prey has for a predator who's decided to hunt. Jennifer's relief was palpable, physical, a weight lifting that seemed to add inches to her height. You're a pilot. I was. Raina moved past her toward the cockpit, her stride automatic measured. She didn't mention the Distinguished Flying Cross, didn't mention the 3 silver stars, didn't mention that the President of the United States had once called her America's deadliest angel. Those were stories for people who had time for stories. At 37,000 feet with both pilots incapacitated and 317 lives hanging in the balance, there was only time for truth. The cockpit door stood before her, that threshold between passenger and pilot, between saved and savior. Her hand found the handle with the same certainty it had once found the stick of a $60 million fighter jet. Behind her, she could hear the whispers starting, the questions, the desperate hope of people who wanted to believe that the woman from 7B was their deliverance. She pulled open the door and stepped into a nightmare painted in warning lights and silence. Captain Morrison was slumped over the yoke, his face the wrong color for anything resembling life. The first officer, younger, maybe 30, was conscious but wrong, his pupils different sizes, his hands shaking with the kind of tremor that preceded complete neural collapse. The instrument panel was a Christmas tree of warnings, reds and ambers competing for attention in the artificial twilight of the cockpit. Food poisoning, the first officer managed, his words slurred. Both ate the fish in the lounge. Raina's assessment took 3 seconds. 2 pilots down, autopilot engaged but struggling. Weather system ahead, she could see it through the windscreen, a wall of cumulonimbus that reached up to God. The 777 was starting to buck, subtle but growing, like a horse sensing its rider's weakness. She slid into Morrison's seat, her hands finding the controls with an intimacy that 7 years couldn't erase. The 777 was bigger than anything she'd flown in uniform, a commercial giant that carried families instead of weapons, but physics was physics. Lift was lift, thrust was thrust, and death was still death, whether it came from a surface-to-air missile or a thunderstorm at altitude. The intercom crackled to life. She could have said anything, could have offered reassurance, platitudes, the kind of soft lies civilians expected. Instead, she gave them what she'd always given the Marines when she'd rolled in danger close. The truth, delivered with the kind of calm that only comes from accepting death and then choosing to fight it anyway. This is Captain Volkov. I have the aircraft. In seat 7A, the businessman who'd spent 2 hours trying to catch her attention finally understood why she hadn't noticed him at all. You don't notice ants when you're an eagle, even when you're pretending to be one of them, texting about groceries, sitting in economy, playing human. The storm ahead grew larger, darker, a wall of violence that would test every hour of her 8,000 logged, every instinct, every prayer she'd ever whispered in a cockpit. But Raina Volkov, whisper, had danced with death before, had felt it brush her wings over Helmand, had tasted it in the smoke of her burning F-16, had carried it under her wings in the form of GPS-guided democracy. She pulled back Morrison's body, securing him with the practiced efficiency of someone who dealt with death in confined spaces before. The first officer was fatting fast, but she needed him conscious for another few minutes. What's your name? Jenkins, Tom Jenkins. Tom, I need you to stay with me for 10 more minutes. Can you do that? He nodded, the movement sending fresh waves of agony across his features. But he kept his hands near the controls, ready to assist even as his body rebelled against consciousness. The radio crackled. American 447, this is Denver Center. We show you deviating from flight path. Please confirm status. Raina's hand found the radio with the same certainty it had once found the trigger on her F-16 stick. Her voice, when it came, carried none of the earlier gentleness. This was whisper speaking now, the pilot who'd been offered a position with the Thunderbirds but turned it down because aerobatics felt hollow after combat. Denver Center, American 447 declaring emergency. Both primary pilots incapacitated. I'm a qualified pilot assuming command. Request immediate vectors for weather avoidance and nearest suitable airport. The pause on the other end stretched long enough for doubt to creep in. Then, American 447, confirm you have qualified pilot at controls. Denver, this is Captain Raina Volkov, former United States Air Force, fighter qualification F-16, 8,000 hours logged. I have the aircraft. Another pause. She could imagine the controllers scrambling, someone Googling her name, finding the headlines from 7 years ago. Female fighter pilot saves dozen Marines in danger close airstrike. First woman to shoot down enemy aircraft in combat. Decorated pilot leaves service after Afghanistan incident. They wouldn't find the details of that last one. Those were classified, sealed behind walls of paperwork that protected both her honor and the Air Force's reputation. But they'd find enough. Enough to know that American 447 had just gone from certain disaster to having a fighting chance. Captain Volkov, the controller's voice returned, different now, weighted with recognition. Denver Center confirms, we have you on radar. Weather cell bearing 270, 30 miles and closing. Recommend immediate turn to heading 180, descent to flight level 330. She was already banking before he finished speaking, her hands coaxing the massive aircraft into a turn that would have been aggressive in a fighter, let alone a commercial jumbo. In the cabin behind her, passengers felt the shift, the sudden sense of purpose that replaced the drift of disaster. They didn't know that their salvation wore yoga pants and a Northwestern University sweatshirt. Didn't know that she'd been planning to spend the flight reading a book about organic gardening. The storm wasn't giving up without a fight. Turbulence hit them like a fist, sending anything unsecured flying through the cabin. But Raina had flown through worse. Had threading the needle between SAM sites and AAA, had put her F-16 through maneuvers that should have torn the wings off, had landed on a carrier deck in a borrowed Navy Hornet just to win a bet with a Marine pilot who'd said Air Force couldn't handle the boat. American 447, be advised, nearest suitable airport is Denver International, bearing 090, distance 170 miles. Chicago O'Hare is possible at 210 miles. Your call. Your call. How many times had she heard those words? How many times had lives hung on her decision, her judgment, her ability to read the sky like scripture? She checked fuel, checked weather, checked the growing pallor of Tom Jenkins beside her. Denver was closer, but the weather was moving that way. Chicago meant threading between storm cells, dancing with giants in a plane that wasn't built for dancing. Denver Center, American 447, requesting vectors to Chicago O'Hare. Copy that, American 447. Turn left heading 070, maintain flight level 330. Chicago Center will take you at the boundary. Captain Volkov, good luck. She almost smiled. Luck. In the fighter community they had a saying, better to be good than lucky. But the truth that only the dead knew was that eventually everyone's luck ran out. The question was whether your skill could carry you past that moment when fortune turned her back. The 777 steadied under her hands, responding to her touch like it recognized authority. Not the authority of rank or title, but the deeper authority of someone who'd been to the edge and back, who'd seen their own death reflected in a missile's exhaust plume and lived to never quite tell the tale. Behind her, 317 passengers sat in various states of terror and hope, unaware that their pilot had once been court-martialed for disobeying a direct order, an order that would have left those 12 Marines to die in an Afghan valley. The charges had been dropped when the Marines' commander, a full-bird colonel with 3 Purple Hearts, had walked into the court-martial proceedings and saluted her in full view of the presiding officers. But the damage was done. The Air Force couldn't keep a pilot who'd proven she'd choose lives over orders, morality over command structure. So she'd left, hung up her wings, became another veteran in a country full of them, distinguished only by the dreams that woke her at 3 a.m., the phantom sensation of G-forces when she stood too quickly, the way she still checked the sky for threats even in suburban parking lots. "Tom," she said to the failing first officer, "I need you to watch the engine temps for me. Just watch and tell me if anything changes. Can you do that?" He managed a thumbs up, though the gesture cost him. She could see him fatting, his body's desperate fight against whatever toxin had taken down both pilots, but he kept his eyes on the gauges, professional to the end. The radio crackled again. "American 447, Chicago Center, we have you on our scope. Be advised, we're clearing all traffic from your path. O'Hare is preparing for emergency landing, equipment standing by." Equipment standing by. That meant fire trucks, ambulances, the full crash response. They were preparing for the worst while she fought for the best. It was a familiar dance, one she'd performed over hostile territory more times than she could count. Except then, the only life at risk had been her own. Now she carried 317 souls, including the little girl in 23C who'd been crying since the captain's announcement, the newlyweds in first class still wearing their lei from Hawaii, the soldier in uniform she'd noticed during boarding, a staff sergeant with the tired eyes of someone coming home from deployment. The storm cells loomed ahead, towers of malevolence that reached up 50,000 feet, higher than the 777 could climb even if she asked it to. She'd have to thread between them, find the valleys of clear air that existed in the spaces between giants. In an F-16, she could have danced through them, using the fighter's agility to slice through gaps that would close seconds later. But the 777 was a bus, not a ballet dancer. She'd have to be smarter, reading the weather radar like a battlefield map, anticipating the storm's moves 3 steps ahead. American 447, winds at O'Hare currently 320 at 25, gusting 35. Runway 28 left cleared for your approach when ready. Crosswind landing in gusting conditions with a plane she'd never flown before and one pilot dead, another dying. The odds makers in Vegas would have called it impossible, but Vegas odds makers had never seen her put an F-16 down on a dirt road in Afghanistan with half her hydraulics gone and Taliban fighters closing in. Chicago, American 447, beginning descent. Request continuous updates on wind conditions. She eased the throttles back, feeling the big plane settle into a descent that would take them through the weather. The first drops of rain hit the windscreen, then more, until the outside world disappeared behind sheets of water. The plane bucked, caught in the storm's outer bands. Behind her, she could hear the gasps and cries from the cabin, the sound of 317 people discovering their mortality simultaneously. But Raina Volkov was somewhere else. She was 28 again, flying night missions over Baghdad when the SAMs came up like deadly fireworks. She was 31, pulling 9GS to evade a missile that had her name on it. She was 33, making the impossible shot that saved those Marines, placing a 500-pound JDAM so close to friendlies that shrapnel had scarred their armor. The turbulence intensified, violent enough that even she had to fight to keep control. The 777 wasn't meant for this kind of punishment. But then again, she wasn't meant to have survived Afghanistan either. Sometimes the universe made exceptions for those who refused to accept its verdict. "Whisper," Tom Jenkins mumbled beside her, his eyes unfocused but his mind still processing. Your whisper." She glanced at him, surprised. Few people outside the fighter community knew that call sign, fewer still connected it to her real name. The military had been careful about operational security, even in their press releases. "How?" she asked, working the controls through another violent updraft. "My brother," he managed. "Marine Korangal Valley, 2017, you saved his unit." The Korangal. She remembered it with the clarity reserved for moments that define a life. 12 Marines, including a young lieutenant who'd been on his first deployment, pinned down by Taliban fighters in superior positions. The danger-close strike that had put her ordnance within 50 meters of friendlies, close enough that doctrine said it was impossible, close enough that command had tried to stop her. She'd made the drop anyway. All 12 Marines had lived. The court-martial that followed had ended her military career, even though the charges were dropped. You couldn't keep a pilot who'd proven she'd follow her conscience over orders. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. "Williams?" she asked. "Lieutenant Williams." "Captain now," Tom whispered. "Named his daughter after you, Raina Williams, 3 years old." Something twisted in her chest, an emotion she couldn't afford at 30,000 feet in deteriorating conditions. She'd never known what happened to those Marines after that day. Had deliberately avoided finding out, treating it like a chapter closed, a life abandoned. The plane lurched, caught in a downdraft that dropped them 500 feet in 2 seconds. In the cabin, the screaming intensified. But Raina's hands were steady on the controls, her voice calm as she called Chicago Center. "Chicago, American 447, request vector around cell bearing 085. American 447, turn right heading 090, cleared to descend to flight level 250. She banked the plane, feeling the strain on the airframe, hearing the protests of metal pushed beyond its comfort zone. But comfort was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not with Tom Jenkins fatting beside her, his breathing becoming irregular. Not with 317 lives depending on skills she tried to bury in suburban normalcy. The weather radar showed a gap, a narrow corridor between 2 massive cells. It would be tight, requiring precise flying and perfect timing. In an F-16 she wouldn't have hesitated. But the 777 was a different beast, with different limitations, different responses. "Tom," she said, "I need you to call out our ground speed. Can you see it?" He focused with visible effort. 320 knots. Too fast for the turbulence they were about to hit. She pulled the throttles back further, trading speed for control. The plane responded sluggishly, fighting her through the increasingly violent air. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the storm cell in stark relief. It was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, a monument to nature's indifference to human ambition. She'd flown through worse over Afghanistan, when mountain weather could turn from clear to deadly in minutes. But she'd been younger then, confident in her immortality, certain that skill could overcome any challenge. Now at 41, she knew better. Knew that sometimes skill wasn't enough. That sometimes the universe demanded payment for past victories, collected debts when you least expected it. But not today. Not with a 3-year-old girl named after her somewhere in the world. Not with Tom Jenkins fighting to stay conscious beside her, trusting her with his last moments of professional dignity. Not with 317 souls who'd boarded a plane expecting nothing more dangerous than bad airline food. American 447, descend and maintain flight level 200, contact approach on 120.75. She switched frequencies, her movements automatic despite the years away. Muscle memory was a powerful thing, carved into the body through repetition and reinforced by survival. Her hands knew the dance even if her mind had tried to forget the music. Chicago approach, American 447, level 200, inbound with emergency. American 447, Chicago approach, we have you. O'Hare weather, winds 330 at 28 gusting 38, visibility 1 mile in heavy rain, ceiling 300 overcast. Runway 28 left cleared for ILS approach. Emergency equipment standing by. 1 mile visibility, 300-foot ceiling. In Air Force terms, that was minimums, the worst conditions they'd allow for landing. In civilian aviation, many pilots would divert to their alternate. But Raina had landed an F-16 with 0 visibility, using nothing but instruments and instinct, with battle damage that had killed half her flight controls. She began configuring the aircraft for approach, extending flaps, adjusting trim, feeling the big plane transform from cruise configuration to landing configuration. It was like watching a thoroughbred become a draft horse, trading grace for stability. "Tom, I need you to lower the landing gear when I call for it. Can you reach the lever?" He nodded, his hand finding the gear lever with the last of his strength. She could see him fatting, his battle against the poison nearly lost. But he held on, professional to the end, determined to help land the plane he could no longer fly. The approach controller's voice guided her through the weather, vectors and altitudes that would line her up with a runway she couldn't yet see. She flew on instruments, trusting the needles and numbers that told her where she was in three-dimensional space, fighting the spatial disorientation that killed more pilots than enemy fire ever had. At 10 miles out, she called for gear down. Tom managed to pull the lever, the satisfying thunk of landing gear extending vibrating through the airframe. 3 green lights confirmed all gear down and locked. One small victory in a battle still being fought. The rain was torrential now, a biblical deluge that turned the windscreen opaque. She flew by faith and instruments, following the ILS needles that would guide her to a runway that existed more in hope than vision. The crosswind pushed them sideways, requiring constant correction, a dance of rudder and aileron that would have been challenging in perfect conditions. At 5 miles, she still couldn't see anything but gray. The automated voice called out altitudes: 1,000, 500, 400. At 300 feet, exactly at minimums, the runway lights burst through the murk like salvation itself. But they were 30 degrees off centerline, the crosswind having pushed them despite her corrections. She sideslipped the massive aircraft, a maneuver that belonged in a Cessna, not a 777, crossing controls to simultaneously lose altitude and correct their alignment. Tom Jenkins had gone silent, slumped in his seat, the last of his strength spent. Captain Morrison remained motionless, beyond help. She was alone now, truly alone, with seconds to make decisions that would be analyzed for years if she got them wrong. The runway rushed up to meet them, rain-slicked and unforgiving. She held the crab angle until the last possible second, then kicked the rudder to align with the centerline just as the main gear kissed the concrete. The plane weather-vaned, trying to turn into the wind, but she held it straight with a combination of rudder and differential braking that would have impressed even her old instructor pilots. The nose gear touched down and she pulled the throttles to idle, engaging reverse thrust. The plane slowed, obedient finally, recognizing that it was home. As they turned off the runway onto the taxiway, emergency vehicles swarmed them, lights painting the rain in reds and blues. She set the parking brake and shut down the engines, her hands moving through the shutdown checklist with the same precision she'd maintained throughout. Only when the engine spooled down to silence did she allow herself a single deep breath, the kind that marked the end of a mission, the transition from warrior to woman. The cockpit door burst open. Paramedics flooded in, immediately attending to Morrison and Jenkins. She stepped aside, letting them work her part in this drama complete. But as they loaded Tom Jenkins onto a stretcher, his eyes flickered open one last time, finding hers. "Tell my brother," he whispered, barely audible. "Tell him Whisper brought me home." She nodded, a promise made in the brotherhood of those who touched the sky and lived to tell about it. The paramedics carried him out, leaving her alone in the cockpit that had been her battlefield, her arena, her redemption. Through the side window, she could see passengers deplaning via emergency slides, the evacuation proceeding with the ordered chaos of a drill suddenly made real. The little girl from 23C was carried by her father, no longer crying but clutching a stuffed elephant with the desperation of childhood's small comforts. The newlyweds helped an elderly woman down the slide. Their honeymoon lay incongruous in the Chicago rain. The staff sergeant, she could see him now, was helping organize the evacuation, taking charge with the natural authority of those who'd learned leadership under fire. A hand touched her shoulder. She turned to find Jennifer, the flight attendant who'd found her in 7B, tears streaming down her face. Captain Volkov, Reyna, I don't know how to. You did your job, Reyna said simply. We all did our jobs. But Jennifer shook her head. You don't understand. My daughter was on this plane, my 16-year-old daughter flying alone to visit her dad. She was in 34F and I couldn't leave my station to check on her, couldn't. The woman's composure finally shattered. You saved my baby. Reyna pulled the woman into an embrace, feeling the weight of those 317 souls settling onto her shoulders like an old, familiar burden. This was why she'd left the Air Force. This weight, this responsibility for lives that weren't statistics or mission parameters, but people with daughters and brothers and stories still being written. An airline executive appeared in the doorway, his suit impeccable despite the chaos, his face a mask of professional gratitude mixed with liability concerns. Captain Volkov, on behalf of American Airlines, I cannot express. Tom Jenkins, she interrupted. First Officer Tom Jenkins stayed conscious long enough to help me land this plane while dying of food poisoning. Captain Morrison gave his last conscious act to calling for help. The flight attendants kept 317 people calm during hell. I just flew the plane. The executive nodded, understanding. There would be time for longer conversations, for depositions and reports, and probably a lawsuit or two. But not now. Now there was only the rain on the aluminum skin of the aircraft, the distant sound of sirens, and the knowledge that everyone who'd boarded this flight would disembark from it. She walked through the empty cabin, past scattered belongings and oxygen masks hanging like yellow flowers from the ceiling. Her phone was still in 7B, face down on the seat where she'd left it. She picked it up, seeing the unfinished text to her daughter still waiting. Don't forget the... She completed it. Don't forget the milk, and I love you, home soon. Send. 3 hours later, she sat in a conference room at O'Hare, still in her yoga pants and Northwestern sweatshirt, facing a room full of FAA investigators, airline officials, and at least one person she recognized from her military days, General Patricia Hayes, now retired, gray-haired but still carrying herself like she could order the sun to rise differently. Reyna, the general said, ignoring protocol and the surprised looks from the civilians. When I heard Whisper had come out of retirement to save a plane full of civilians, I had to come. I didn't save them, ma'am, You just did what you always did, Hayes interrupted. The impossible at the worst possible moment with lives on the line. She paused, studying Reyna with eyes that had seen too much. The Koringal Valley, we never got to talk about that. There's nothing to talk about. 12 Marines would disagree, as would their families. Hayes pulled out a folder, worn at the edges from handling. Letters. Every one of them wrote to me, asking me to forward them to you. I've been carrying them for 7 years, hopping for the right moment. Reyna stared at the folder like it might explode. General. There's more, Hayes continued. The Air Force wants to recall you. Full reinstatement, your choice of assignment. The court-martial was expunged from your record 2 years ago. Took some doing, but those 12 Marines have some pull now. One's a congressman. The room was silent, everyone watching the interplay between the two women who'd shaped air warfare doctrine in ways the civilians couldn't understand. Reyna took the folder but didn't open it. Some things were too heavy to carry in public. I have a life now, she said quietly. A daughter who needs me to come home. A garden that's probably dying because I've been gone 3 days. A book club that's reading Dostoevsky for reasons I can't fathom. Hayes smiled, the expression transforming her from general to grandmother. And you were texting about groceries when hell broke loose. She stood, smoothing her skirt with military precision. The offer stands, Captain. No expiration date. The sky misses you. After Hayes left, the debriefing continued for 2 more hours. Technical questions about her approach, about the decision to continue to Chicago instead of diverting to Denver, about the side-slip maneuver that had probably stressed the airframe beyond Boeing specifications. She answered them all with the patient precision of someone who'd been debriefed after combat missions, who knew that every detail mattered when lives had been at stake. Finally, they released her. American Airlines had arranged a hotel room, a first-class ticket home tomorrow, and probably a lifetime of free flights she'd never use. But first, she had a promise to keep. She found Tom Jenkins at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, unconscious but stable, the toxin finally being purged from his system. His brother was there, no longer the lieutenant she'd saved but Captain Williams, wearing his dress blues, his chest heavy with ribbons that told their own story of the years since Quarangle. He stood when she entered, coming to attention with the respect reserved for those who'd earned it in blood and fire. "Ma'am." "Captain," she nodded, then looked at the small girl holding his hand, dark-haired and serious-eyed. "This must be Raina." The little girl looked up at her father, then at the woman who shared her name. "Daddy says you're the reason he comes home." Raina knelt, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "Your daddy is the reason your daddy comes home. I just helped with the traffic." Williams laughed, the sound carrying years of weight. "Tom called me from the plane during the approach, said Whisper was flying, said you were bringing him home." His voice caught. "Seems you make a habit of that." She stood uncomfortable with the gratitude, the weight of being someone's salvation. "How are the others, from Quarangle?" "Alive, all of them. Martinez is a teacher now. Johnson runs a construction company. Thompson's getting his Ph.D. He paused. "We have a reunion every year on the anniversary. We toast the pilot who gave us the chance to have reunions." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter. "Mom, did you really land a plane? It's all over the news. Sarah's mom says you're a hero. Also, we're out of milk." She smiled, the first genuine smile since she'd stood up from 7B heroes or for movies and memorial services. She was just a mother who'd remembered how to fly when flying was needed. But that was a conversation for later, for quiet moments when she could explain that sometimes ordinary people did extraordinary things not because they were special, but because they were there. "I have to go," she told Williams. "But tell Tom, tell him he flew that approach with me, every foot of it." Walking through O'Hare, she passed a television showing CNN. Her military photo was on screen, younger, sharper, wearing the flight suit like it was skin. The crawler read, "Decorated fighter pilot saves 317 lives in emergency landing." They'd have the story for days, dissecting every moment, turning her into something she wasn't, a hero returned, a warrior reborn. But she knew better. She'd been a woman texting about groceries who happened to have 8,000 hours of stick time, a mother who'd once been Whisper, a gardener who could still read weather radar like sheet music. The world wanted clean narratives, clear transformations. The truth was messier, that you could leave the cockpit but never really land, that you could hang up your wings but still feel them in dreams. The rain had stopped by the time she reached the hotel. Chicago sprawled before her, lights reflecting off wet streets, a city going about its business unaware that death had passed over it at 37,000 feet and chosen to keep flying. Somewhere in that maze of lights, 317 people were telling their families about the turbulence, the fear, the woman who'd appeared from nowhere to fly them home. Her phone rang, an unknown number, but she recognized the area code, DC. "Captain Volkov." The voice was young, nervous. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Air Force personnel. I'm calling about General Hayes' offer." "Tell the general thank you," Raina interrupted gently. "But I already have a mission." "Ma'am." She thought about her daughter, probably doing homework while pretending to watch Netflix. About the book club struggling through Russian literature. About the garden where she was trying to grow tomatoes in soil that had never known war. "Living," she said. "It's harder than flying, but someone's got to do it." She hung up and texted her daughter, "Home tomorrow, we'll get milk together. And yes, I landed a plane, but the real story is better. Love you." The response was immediate. "Mom, you're weird, love you too, don't forget the cereal." Tomorrow she'd wake up and fly home as a passenger, sitting in first class with too much legroom and not enough purpose. She'd pick up,